My name is Julia Hartman, and I never imagined I'd be standing at my husband's funeral, watching my own family treat his service like a social obligation they'd rather skip. The pews of First Methodist were filled with faces that mattered. Daniel's students from the past 15 years, neighbors who'd watched us plant our garden each spring, fellow teachers who'd shared countless staff meetings and lunch breaks with him. But the 3 empty seats in the front row, reserved for my parents and sister, remained glaringly vacant until the service was nearly half over. Daniel and I had been married for 8 years when the cancer took him. 8 beautiful, ordinary years in our little craftsman house on Maple Street, where he'd grade papers at the kitchen table while I planned my nursing shifts around his schedule. He taught high school English, and every December, our refrigerator would bloom with handmade thank you cards from students who finally understood Shakespeare or found their voice in creative writing. That was Daniel, quietly changing lives, one teenager at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of his funeral, I'd stood in our bedroom holding the navy dress he'd always said brought out my eyes. "You look beautiful in blue, Jules," he'd whisper when I'd catch him watching me get ready for work. The memory hit so hard I had to sit on our unmade bed, breathing through the wave of grief that threatened to buckle my knees. Pastor Henry Caldwell had known us both since we'd moved to town. When I called him 3 days after Daniel passed, his voice was gentle but firm. "We'll do this right, Julia. Daniel deserves that, and so do you." Henry had watched our love story unfold from the church pews, had counseled us through Daniel's diagnosis 18 months ago, and had sat with us in those final weeks when hope became about comfort rather than cure. The church filled slowly that morning. Mrs. Patterson from next door squeezed my hand as she took her seat. "He helped my grandson with algebra every Tuesday after school," she whispered. "Never asked for a penny. Said it was just neighbors helping neighbors." Behind her, I spotted the young faces of Daniel's current students, some crying openly, others staring ahead with that hollow look teenagers get when they encounter death for the first time. Then Maria Lopez walked in, and my heart nearly broke all over again. She'd been one of Daniel's first students when we moved here, an angry 15-year-old who'd been shuffled through foster homes and had given up on adults keeping their promises. Daniel saw through her defiance to the scared kid underneath. He tutored her through her GED, helped her apply for scholarships, and celebrated when she became the first in her family to graduate college. Now 28 and a social worker herself, Maria had driven 3 hours to be here. "Mrs. Hartman," she said, wrapping me in a fierce hug, "I'm so sorry. He changed my life. You both did, welcoming me for Sunday dinners when I had nowhere else to go." Her voice broke. "I wouldn't be who I am without him." That's when I knew I could get through this service. Daniel's real family was here. The lives he'd touched, the community he served, the people who'd chosen to love him back. It gave me strength for what I knew was coming. At 10:47, 13 minutes after the service began, I heard the familiar click of expensive heels on the church's hardwood floors. Mother arrived first, Eleanor Whitfield in her perfectly tailored black suit and pearls, scanning the crowd with the calculating gaze she used at charity galas. Behind her came my father, Richard, checking his phone even as he slid into the pew. Caroline followed, my younger sister who'd married the investment banker our parents had always hoped I'd choose instead of a small-town teacher. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't offer a touch or whispered condolence. Mother simply sat ramrod straight, lips pursed in what I'd learned to recognize as her disapproval face. Daddy adjusted his cufflinks twice and glanced at his watch. Caroline studied her manicure, occasionally looking up to survey the modest church with barely concealed disdain. When Pastor Caldwell invited me to speak, I walked to the pulpit on unsteady legs, my prepared words suddenly feeling inadequate. But as I looked out at the faces, Maria's encouraging smile, Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes, rows of teenagers who loved my husband,
The words came from my heart instead of my notes. Daniel used to say that a life well lived isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away. He gave away his patience to frustrated students, his Saturday mornings to anyone who needed help moving furniture, his evenings to me, listening to my stories about difficult patients and celebrating the small victories of my day. I caught my mother rolling her eyes and felt a familiar sting of shame, but I pressed on. He believed that love isn't something you save for special occasions. It's something you spend freely, trusting it will multiply. And looking out at you all today, I see how right he was. Daniel's love multiplied through every life he touched, every kindness he shared, every moment he chose compassion over convenience. The church was quiet except for gentle sniffles and the rustle of tissues. He told me once that he hoped his legacy wouldn't be found in any bank account or trophy case, but in the hearts of people who learn from his example to be a little kinder, a little braver, a little more willing to believe in someone else's potential. Today, I see that legacy everywhere I look. Thank you for loving him back. As I returned to my seat, Maria reached across the aisle to squeeze my hand. Pastor Henry's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Even some of my family's wealthy friends from across town seemed moved, nodding respectfully as I passed. But when I glanced at my family's pew, Mother was whispering something to Caroline that made my sister smirk. Daddy was openly checking his phone. Whatever I'd said hadn't touched them, or if it had, they were too proud to let it show.
The service concluded with Amazing Grace, Daniel's favorite hymn. As the final notes faded, I knew the hardest part was still coming. The gathering outside, the awkward condolences, the moment when my family would finally have to acknowledge what they'd lost when they chose social status over loving Daniel. I just didn't realize how cruel they were willing to be. The September air was crisp as mourners filtered out of the church, clustering in small groups on the front lawn. I stood near the steps, accepting hugs and sharing memories, feeling held by the community Daniel and I had called home. Mrs. Chen from the library was telling me about the children's reading program Daniel had volunteered for when I heard my mother's voice pitched to Carrie. Well, I suppose this is what happens when someone chooses to abandon their family. The conversations around us slowed, then stopped. I turned to find Mother standing near the church's memorial rose garden, her perfectly modulated voice designed to reach exactly the ears she wanted. Caroline stood beside her, arms crossed, while Daddy lingered a few steps back, uncomfortable but not intervening. "Excuse me?" Pastor Caldwell stepped closer, his eyebrows raised. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not sure I understand." Mother's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Pastor, surely you've noticed how my daughter has isolated herself from family these past few years. Daniel was a sweet man, I'm sure, but Julia chose this modest little life instead of accepting the opportunities her family could have provided. And now, well," she gestured vaguely at the church, "the mourners, the life I'd built. This is the result." Heat flooded my cheeks. Around us, I could feel neighbors and friends shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. Maria took a step closer to me, her social worker instincts kicking in. "Eleanor," I said quietly, using her first name the way I had since childhood, "this isn't the place." "When is the place?" Caroline interrupted, her voice honey-sweet but venomous. "You've barely spoken to us in months. Daddy called 4 times during Daniel's illness, and you returned exactly 1 call. We had to hear about the funeral from the newspaper obituary." The lie hit like a slap. I'd called them the day after Daniel's diagnosis. Mother had cut the conversation short because she was late for bridge club. When I'd called to tell them about Daniel's final weeks, Daddy's secretary had taken a message that was never returned. Caroline had been too busy with her charity auction planning committee to come to the hospital when I begged her to visit. "That's not," I started, but Mother held up a perfectly manicured hand.
Julia has always been selfish, she announced to the gathered crowd, many of whom I'd known for years. Even as a child, she preferred books to social events, nursing school to the sorority we'd chosen for her, and ultimately a teacher's salary to the security her family could have provided. And now, well, she gestured vaguely at the church, the mourners, the life I'd built. This is the result. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched faces I knew, colleagues from the hospital, parents of Daniel's students, neighbors who'd brought casseroles during his treatment, process what they'd just heard. Some were shocked, others angry. Mrs. Patterson's mouth hung open. Mrs. Whitfield, Pastor Caldwell's voice carried the authority he usually reserved for sermon topics like forgiveness and grace. I think perhaps— No, it's fine, I said, finding my voice, though it shook. Let her finish. Mother's eyes glittered with something that might have been triumph. There's nothing more to say, dear. You made your choices. You chose a cramped house over the family estate, a teacher over a doctor, struggle over security. You chose to nurse a dying man instead of building a life that mattered. And now, well, you want us to pretend this was all noble and beautiful, when really it was just stubbornness. Caroline nodded, emboldened by Mother's performance. We tried to help, Julia. Remember when Marcus offered Daniel that position at the private academy? Better pay, better students, better future? But no, Daniel had to stay loyal to this place. And you supported him. You could have pushed him towards something better, but instead you enabled his lack of ambition. Something cold and sharp settled in my chest. Marcus was Caroline's husband, and his offer had come with conditions. Daniel would have had to change his teaching style, abandon the struggling students he loved most, and turn his classroom into a prep course for wealthy kids heading to Ivy League schools. Daniel declined politely, but I'd seen how the offer had hurt him, the implication that his work here wasn't valuable enough. Daniel's lack of ambition? I repeated, my voice deadly quiet. Daniel, who stayed after school 3 nights a week tutoring kids like Maria for free. Daniel, who spent his own money on books for students whose families couldn't afford them. Daniel, who wrote college recommendation letters on weekends and attended every graduation of every student who'd struggled in his classroom. I looked directly at my mother. Eleanor, you want to know about choices? I chose love. I chose partnership. I chose a man who measured his worth by how many lives he touched, not how much money he accumulated. And yes, I chose him over a family that measured my value by how well I could marry up.
Maria stepped fully to my side now, her young face fierce with protective anger. Mrs. Hartman, she said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Hartman saved my life. He was the first adult who ever believed I could be more than my circumstances. And you've been the mother and father I needed when my real ones failed me. Don't let anyone tell you that wasn't a life that mattered. Around us, I saw nods of agreement. Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, Janet from the school board. Even some of my parents' wealthy friends looked uncomfortable with Mother's display. But Mother wasn't finished. How touching, she said, her smile turning cruel. But charity cases don't pay mortgages, do they, Julia? What exactly is your plan now? This house of yours, Daniel's medical bills, your own modest salary. You'll come crawling back to family eventually. You always do when reality sets in. The words hung in the autumn air like a challenge. For a moment, I wavered, feeling 8 years old again and desperate for my mother's approval. Then I remembered Daniel's hand in mine during his final week. His whispered words, "Don't let them convince you that our love was small, Jules. Love is never small." I won't be crawling anywhere, I said clearly, and I won't be apologizing for choosing a love story over a transaction. I turned away from them then, toward the people who had truly mourned with me, who had celebrated Daniel's life instead of dismissing it. But Mother wasn't finished. We'll see how long that pride lasts, Julia. We'll see how noble you feel when the bills come due.
The gathering began to disperse after that, people offering quieter condolences and avoiding my family's corner of the lawn. As I watched Mother, Daddy, and Caroline walk toward their expensive cars without so much as a goodbye, I felt hollow and shaken. Pastor Caldwell touched my elbow gently. "Julia, I'm so sorry. That was cruel," I finished, "but not surprising. They've never understood why I chose this life." "Their loss," Maria said fiercely, then softer. "Mrs. Hartman, are you okay, really?" I wasn't sure. The public humiliation stung, and beneath it was the old familiar ache of disappointing parents who'd never learned to love me as I was, rather than who they wanted me to be. But as I looked around at the faces that remained, people who'd known Daniel and me as we truly were, I felt something else. "I will be," I said, and meant it. What I didn't know was that Daniel, and his quiet way, had already made it sure of it. The quiet hit me like a wall when I opened the front door. For 18 months, our house had been filled with the sounds of Daniel's illness, medical equipment, visiting nurses, hushed phone calls with doctors, and the television he'd kept on low just for background noise. Now the silence felt heavy and complete. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stared at the remains of the life we'd built together. Daniel's coffee mug still sat by the sink from the morning 3 days ago when he'd been too weak to finish his last cup. His reading glasses lay folded beside a stack of ungraded papers he'd never get to return. Everything exactly as he'd left it, as if he might walk through the door and pick up where he'd left off. The confrontation with my family played on repeat in my mind. Mother's voice, "This is what happens when someone chooses to abandon their family." Caroline's smirk as she delivered her final threat about bills coming due. The way they'd made my love for Daniel sound like a character flaw, a weakness to be pitied. I sank into Daniel's favorite armchair, the one with the reading light perfectly positioned and a permanent indent from 8 years of evening papers and weekend novels. The leather was worn soft from use, and it still smelled faintly of his cologne. Closing my eyes, I could almost pretend he was just in the kitchen making tea, about to appear with 2 steaming mugs and ask about my day. "You knew they'd be awful, didn't you, Daniel?" I whispered to the empty room. "You tried to warn me." He had, in his gentle way. 3 weeks before he died, when the pan medication made his thoughts drift, but his eyes were still sharp with love, he'd taken my hand during one of my mother's rare visits. "She's going to be cruel to you, Jules," he'd said after Mother left early, claiming she had a hospital board meeting that couldn't wait. "After I'm gone, she's going to try to convince you that this," he gestured weakly around our modest home, "wasn't enough, that we weren't enough." I'd brushed his concern away then, focused on adjusting his pillows and checking his medication schedule. "Don't worry about her," I'd said. "I can handle whatever she throws at me." Daniel's smile had been sad and knowing. "I know you can, but I want you to remember something when she does." He'd pulled me down for a kiss on my forehead. "Love is never a mistake, Julia. What we built here, it's real. It's valuable. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Now, sitting in his chair, I understood what he was trying to tell me. Mother and Caroline and Daddy would try to rewrite our story, make it smaller, make it seem like settling instead of
choosing. They'd point to our tiny house, Daniel's modest salary, the simplicity of our life, and call it failure. But they hadn't seen Daniel's face when he'd read thank you letters from former students. They hadn't been there for our Sunday mornings, lazy in bed with coffee and crossword puzzles, or our evening walks around the neighborhood, hands linked, planning our garden for next spring. They'd missed the quiet joy of a love that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Call me when you're ready to discuss practical matters. The house won't sell itself." I turned the phone face down, anger flaring hot in my chest. She was already calculating, already planning how to liquidate the life Daniel and I had built. As if our home was just another asset to be managed, another proof of our poor judgment that needed correction. That's when I noticed it. A manila envelope on Daniel's desk,
propped against his lamp where I couldn't miss it. My name was written across the front in his careful teacher's handwriting, along with a date from 2 months ago. Inside was a single sheet of his school letterhead and a sealed envelope marked, "For Julia," to be opened after funeral. The letter was brief. "My dearest Jules, if you're reading this, then you've survived today, and I'm proud of you for that. I know your family was difficult. I know they made you feel small. But I need you to remember that they're wrong about us, about you, about what matters. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Mr. Green will be reading my will of his office. I've made some changes I didn't tell you about, not to keep secrets, but to protect you from their questions and demands while you grieved. Your mother thinks love is a limited resource, something to be hoarded and dispensed only when it serves her purposes. She's wrong. Love multiplies when you give it freely, and you've given so much, Julia. To me, to your patients, to this community. That's your strength, not your weakness. Whatever they said today, whatever they'll try to say tomorrow, remember that you chose correctly. We chose correctly. What we had was real and valuable and beautiful, and no one can take that away. Trust me one more time, sweetheart. Trust that I took care of you the only way I knew how." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All my love, always. Daniel. P.S. Don't let them see you cry tomorrow. Save your tears for home, where they can heal instead of being used against you. My hands shook as I reread the letter twice, then 3 times. Changes to his will? Daniel had been meticulous about financial matters, partly because of his modest income and partly because he'd known his illness would be expensive. We'd gone over our simple will together, the house to me, his small life insurance policy, his teacher's pension. Nothing complicated, nothing that should require changes. But the sealed envelope suggested otherwise, and the way he'd written about protecting me from their questions and demands made my stomach clench with anxiety and something that might have been hope. I thought about Caroline's text, her assumption that I'd need to sell the house quickly, about Mother's parting shot at the funeral, her certainty that I'd come crawling back when financial reality hit, about the medical bills that indeed were mounting, the mortgage payments I'd need to handle alone, the future that felt suddenly uncertain and overwhelming. Daniel had faced his death with characteristic thoughtfulness, planning for my protection even when I hadn't realized I'd need it. Whatever changes he'd made, whatever he'd arranged, he'd done it quietly, without drama or fanfare, the way he'd done everything else in our life together. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest, feeling closer to him than I had since he'd died. Tomorrow, at 2 p.m., I'd find out what my husband had really thought about my family's judgment, and their certainty that love wasn't enough to sustain a life. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Daniel had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. It's what made him such a good teacher. Apparently, he'd been planning his final lesson all along. I just hoped I was ready to learn what he had to teach. I wouldn't learn until much later what happened at the Whitfield estate the morning of the will reading, but Caroline would eventually tell me during one of her guilt-ridden phone calls months afterwards. I wish I'd been a fly on the wall in Mother's pristine living room, watching them calculate and scheme, while I was at home rereading Daniel's letter and trying to prepare myself for whatever he'd arranged. According to Caroline, Mother had summoned them both for what she called a family strategy session at 9 sharp, 3 hours before the scheduled appointment with Mr. Green.
Whitfield Estate sat on 5 manicured acres in the wealthy part of town, a colonial revival mansion that had been featured in Southern Living twice and served as the backdrop for Mother's endless charity fundraisers. "We need to discuss Julia's situation," Mother had announced, settling into her favorite Queen Anne chair with a cup of coffee in bone china that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. "This will reading is just a formality, but we should be prepared for the aftermath." Daddy had been at his usual spot behind the Wall Street Journal, but he'd lowered it enough to grunt his agreement. "Poor girl's going to be in over her head. Teacher's salary, medical bills, that little house probably mortgaged to the hilt. Exactly. Mother's voice had carried that particular satisfaction she got when her predictions came true. Daniel was sweet enough, but hardly practical. I doubt there's much beyond some small life insurance policy and whatever pittance teachers contribute to their pension funds. Caroline had been scrolling through her phone, half listening, but she'd looked up at this. What about the house? It's small, but property values in that area have been climbing. Needs too much work, Daddy had said dismissively. I drove by there last week. Roof looks tired, foundation's probably settling. She'll be lucky to break even after repairs and realtor fees. This was news to me when Caroline confessed it later. Daddy had been driving by my house, evaluating it like a potential investment while I was still grieving. The thought should have hurt more than it did by then, but I'd grown immune to their casual cruelties. The real issue, Mother had continued, is Julia's pride. She's always been too stubborn to accept help, even when she desperately needs it. Remember when she insisted on paying for that nursing program herself instead of letting us cover the tuition? I had paid for nursing school with scholarships, student loans, and weekend jobs because I'd wanted to earn my degree without strings attached. Mother's help always came with conditions, subtle at first, then increasingly controlling as the debt of gratitude grew. I'd learned early that independence was worth the extra work. She'll come around, Caroline had said with confidence. Once the bills start piling up and reality sets in, she'll realize she needs family. She always does. But Mother had shaken her head, her expression calculating. Not this time. Yesterday at the funeral, did you see how she looked at us? She's angrier than I've ever seen her. That little speech about choosing love over family, she meant it as a permanent break. So, what's the plan? Daddy had asked, folding his paper with the crisp efficiency he brought to business deals. We wait, Mother had said simply. We let her struggle for a few months, let the financial pressure build, then we approach her with conditions she can't refuse. The house has sentimental value to her, but sentiment doesn't pay mortgages. When she's desperate enough, she'll listen to reason. Caroline had shifted uncomfortably. Despite her loyalty to our parents, she'd always had moments of conscience that surprised me. What kind of conditions? Nothing unreasonable, Mother had replied, her tone suggesting the opposite. She moves back home while she gets back on her feet, sells the house and invests the proceeds properly, considers dating again, someone more suitable this time. Essentially, she accepts that this experiment with independence has run its course. The casual way Mother had dismissed 8 years of my marriage as an experiment would have devastated me if I had heard it then. By the time Caroline repeated it to me, I'd learned to see Mother's cruelty as a reflection of her own limitations, rather than a judgment of my choices. And if she refuses? Daddy had asked. Mother's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then she refuses, but I doubt she will. Julia's always been dramatic, but she's not stupid. Pride is expensive, and she's about to learn exactly how expensive. They'd spent the remaining hour discussing logistics, how long to let me struggle before making their offer, whether to approach me directly or use Pastor Caldwell as an intermediary, what kind of timeline to suggest for selling the house. Throughout it all, they'd spoken about me as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a daughter who was grieving. Just remember, Mother had said, as they'd prepared to leave for the lawyer's office, whatever theatrical nonsense Daniel put in this will, whatever sentimental drivel he wrote about their great love story, the math doesn't lie. She can't afford to maintain this lifestyle alone, and she knows it. Caroline had nodded, but later she'd tell me that something had nagged her during that conversation. Maybe it was the memory of Daniel's kindness during family gatherings, the way he'd always asked genuine questions about her work and remembered details about her children. Maybe it was the look on my face at the funeral when I'd spoken about love multiplying instead of diminishing when shared freely.
Or maybe it was just the growing suspicion that Mother's certainty about Daniel's financial situation was based more on class prejudice than actual knowledge. Whatever it was, Caroline had felt the first stirring of doubt as they'd driven to Mr. Green's office in Daddy's Mercedes, following Mother's Lexus through the tree-lined streets of our small town. For 18 months, they'd watched me care for Daniel through his illness, had seen me
balance nursing shifts with doctor appointments and treatments and the heartbreaking logistics of loving someone who was dying. They'd assumed that devotion made me weak, that choosing love over profit meant I was naive about money and security. They'd counted on my grief making me desperate, my isolation making me willing to accept their conditions for help. What they hadn't considered was that Daniel might have been planning too, that a man who'd spent his career thinking 3 steps ahead of teenagers might have applied that same strategic thinking to protecting his wife from people who'd never understood her worth. As they'd parked outside Mr. Green's modest law office at 1:55 p.m., Mother had checked her lipstick in the rearview mirror and smoothed her already perfect hair. "Remember," she'd said to Caroline and Daddy, "we're here to support Julia through this difficult time. Whatever Daniel's will contains, we respond with sympathy and practical concern for her future." Caroline had nodded, but she'd also noticed the small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of Mother's mouth. Eleanor Whitfield was prepared to be gracious in victory, generous in offering solutions to problems she'd spent months hoping would arise. She had no idea that Daniel had been preparing for this moment, too. I arrived at Mr. Green's office 15 minutes early, partly from nerves and partly because I'd wanted to avoid walking in with my family. The law office occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street with creaking hardwood floors and tall windows that let in the afternoon light. Mr. Green had been Daniel's lawyer for our entire marriage, handling our simple will, the mortgage paperwork, and the advance directives we'd needed during his illness. "Mrs. Hartman," he greeted me warmly, shaking my hand with both of his. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Daniel was a good man." "Thank you," I managed, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I appreciate you handling everything." Mr. Green was in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of patient manner that probably served him well in family law. His office was lined with legal books and family photos, comfortable and unpretentious, exactly the kind of place Daniel would have chosen. "Before the others arrive, I want you to know that Daniel spoke with me several times during his illness about changes to his will. He was very specific about his wishes and very concerned about ensuring you'd be protected. Whatever you hear today, remember that these decisions came from love." My heart started beating faster. What kind of changes? "All in good time," Mr. Green said gently. "But Julia, Daniel was worried about your family's reaction to his provisions. If things become difficult, remember that his wishes are legally binding, regardless of anyone else's opinions." Before I could ask more questions, I heard familiar voices in the waiting room. Mother's laugh, pitched for maximum charm, Caroline's higher tone asking about parking, Daddy's gruff small talk about the weather. My family had arrived, and the careful composure I'd built up all morning threatened to crumble. "You'll be fine," Mr. Green said, as if reading my thoughts. Daniel made sure of it. We settled around the conference table in his office, me on one side, my family on the other, with Mr. Green at the head. Mother had chosen a navy suit that made her look appropriately somber, but still impeccably stylish. Caroline wore black slacks and a cream blouse, her jewelry understated but expensive. Daddy had loosened his tie exactly 1 notch, his concession to grief. They nodded at me politely, as if we were strangers conducting business rather than family gathering to honor a man's final wishes. The distance felt enormous across the small table. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Green began, opening a thick folder. "As you know, we're here to read the last will and testament of Daniel Michael Hartman, executed and witnessed according to the laws of the state." He lifted the first document, and I was startled to see how thick it was.
Our original will was maybe 3 pages long, simple and straightforward. This looked like it had grown substantially. Daniel updated his will several times during his illness, with the final version completed 6 weeks before his death. He was very clear about his mental capacity and his reasons for these changes, and I can attest that he was lucid and determined throughout our discussions. Mother and Caroline exchanged glances. Daddy leaned forward slightly, his business instincts engaging. None of them expected complications. Mr. Green cleared his throat and began to read, I, Daniel Michael Hartman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. Standard opening language, nothing surprising yet. But then Daniel's voice seemed to fill the room through Mr. Green's careful reading. To my beloved wife, Julia Marie Hartman, I leave not just my worldly possessions, but my deepest gratitude for 8 years of love that transformed my life in ways I never thought possible. Julia, you chose to build a life with me knowing it would be modest by some standards, rich in ways that matter by others. You nursed me through my illness with grace and strength, never making me feel like a burden, always helping me feel like a man worth loving. My eyes filled with tears at Daniel's words. Even in death, he was taking care of me, reminding me of our love's value in front of people who'd questioned it. But I noticed Mother shifting impatiently in her chair. Caroline was checking her watch discreetly. They were waiting for Mr. Green to get through the sentimental portion and reach the actual bequests. You sacrificed career opportunities to care for me, the will continued. Turned down the nursing supervisor position at Regional Medical because the hours would have kept us apart during my final months. You chose love over advancement, presence over promotion, and I want the world to know that you chose correctly. This is very touching, Mother interrupted gently, but perhaps we could move to the actual distribution of assets? I'm sure Julia appreciates Daniel's sentiments, but we do have other obligations this afternoon. Mr. Green looked at her over his glasses with the sort of mild disapproval teachers reserve for students who interrupt lessons. Mrs. Whitfield, these sentiments are part of the legal document. Daniel specifically requested that this section be read in full, in the presence of witnesses. Mother's smile tightened, but she nodded for him to continue. Julia, you worried about our future, about money and security and practical matters. You shouldn't have had to carry that burden alone, and I'm sorry that my illness put financial strain on our dreams. But I need you to know that love is never a poor investment. What we built together, the trust, the partnership, the joy we found in simple things, that wealth can't be calculated in any ledger. Caroline was openly fidgeting now, her manicured nails tapping against the table. Daddy had pulled out his phone and was discreetly checking messages. Their impatience was palpable. Their dismissal of Daniel's words as mere sentiment was obvious to everyone in the room. But Mr. Green continued reading, and I could hear Daniel's voice in every carefully chosen phrase, his determination to make sure I understood how much our life together had meant to him. I know your family believes you settled when you chose me. I know they think our modest home and simple pleasures represent some kind of failure on your part. They're wrong, Julia. What we had was extraordinary, and I refuse to let anyone, even in death, diminish what we built together. The room had grown very quiet. Mother's practiced smile had frozen in place. Caroline had stopped fidgeting. Even Daddy was paying attention now, perhaps recognizing the pointed nature of Daniel's words. Which brings me, Mr. Green read, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, to the distribution of my earthly possessions. I have given considerable thought to how my assets should be distributed, and I have chosen to reward loyalty, kindness, and genuine affection rather than blood relation or social expectation. Mother sat up straighter. Caroline's eyes sharpened. Daddy set down his phone entirely. The real will reading was about to begin. Mr. Green paused, glancing around the table at our faces. I was leaning forward, my heart hammering with anticipation. My family had gone very still, their casual confidence replaced with focused attention. Let's begin with specific bequests before moving to the residuary estate. He turned to a new page, and Daniel's voice filled the room again. To Maria Elena Lopez, who honored me by letting me be part of her journey from an angry teenager to a compassionate social worker, I leave the sum of $25,000 to establish the Daniel Hartman Scholarship Fund for first-generation college students. Maria, you proved that family isn't defined by blood, but by choice, by showing up, by believing in each other's potential. Use this money to help other young people discover their own strength. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. $25,000? Daniel and I had always lived paycheck to paycheck. Where had this money come from? Mother's eyebrows had shot up nearly to her hairline. 25,000? She said sharply. For a former student? Mr. Green continued reading without acknowledging her interruption. To Pastor Henry Caldwell, who ministered to my soul and comforted my wife during the darkest period of our lives, I leave my complete collection of first edition American literature, including signed works by Steinbeck, Faulkner, and Morrison, along with the antique oak bookshelf that housed them. Henry, you understand that some treasures can't be measured in dollars. I trust you'll appreciate both the books and the sentiment behind them. My mouth fell open. Daniel's book collection? I'd known he'd had some valuable first editions, inherited from his English professor grandfather, but I'd never realized their worth. He'd always been casual about them, reading them carefully but treating them as books to be enjoyed, rather than investments to be preserved.
Caroline leaned forward aggressively. Just how valuable are we talking about here? These specific bequests seem awfully generous for someone who supposedly had limited assets. Mr. Green's expression remained neutral, but I caught a glimmer of something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. The book collection was appraised at approximately $38,000. But let's continue with the will, shall we? Daddy was now openly staring, his business mind clearly recalculating everything he'd assumed about Daniel's financial situation. Mother's face had gone very pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. To the teachers and staff of Lincoln High School, the will continued, I leave the sum of $15,000 to purchase classroom supplies and resources for students whose families cannot afford them. Let no child go without books, art supplies, or the tools they need to discover their passions because of financial hardship. This is impossible, Mother said flatly. Where did a high school teacher get this kind of money? Julia, did you know about any of this? I shook my head mutely. I'd handled our day-to-day finances, but Daniel had always managed our savings and investments. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning his quiet assurance that we'd be fine. Mr. Green looked at my family with the patient expression of someone who'd been practicing law long enough to recognize greed disguised as concern. Mrs. Whitfield, these assets were accumulated legally over many years of careful saving and wise investing. Daniel was quite frugal in his personal habits, but generous in his charitable giving, as you're discovering. He returned to the will. Now, for the residuary estate. To my beloved wife Julia, I leave everything else. The house at 847 Maple Street, free and clear of all mortgages, my life insurance policy in the amount of $350,000, my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $420,000, my teacher's pension, which will provide monthly income for the remainder of your life, and all personal property not otherwise specifically bequeathed. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at Mr. Green, certain I'd misheard. $350,000 in life insurance? Over $400,000 in investments? The mortgage paid off? I whispered, that's not possible.
We lived so simply, we worried about money constantly. Mr. Green's smile was gentle. Julia, Daniel was one of the most financially disciplined people I've ever worked with. He started investing his first year of teaching, lived well below his means, and never touched his principal except to pay off your mortgage last year when he received his terminal diagnosis. He wanted to ensure you'd never lose your home. Mother had gone from pale to flushed, her composure cracking visibly. This is outrageous! Julia had no idea about these assets? What kind of marriage keeps financial secrets like this? The kind, I said, quietly, finding my voice, where one partner trusts the other completely. Daniel always said he was handling our future, and I believed him. Caroline was frantically calculating on her phone. $750,000, plus the house, plus the pension. Julia, do you understand what this means? I was beginning to. It meant Daniel had spent years quietly building security for us both, never boasting about it, never using it to prove his worth to my family, but Mr. Green wasn't finished. He said, "There's one final section I need to read which Daniel titled, 'A Message to Julia's Family.'" Mother, Caroline, and Daddy all went very still. "To Eleanor, Richard, and Caroline Whitfield," he read, "I want you to know that I was always aware of your disappointment in Julia's choice to marry me. I heard your subtle comments about her settling, your assumptions about my lack of ambition, your certainty that she could have done better with someone of higher social standing." The room was so quiet I could hear the old building settling around us. "I want you to understand that your daughter didn't settle. She chose love over status, partnership over position, character over credentials. She chose correctly, and I spent every day of our marriage trying to prove worthy of that choice." Mother's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. "Julia worried about money because she's responsible and practical, not because we were actually in financial difficulty. I allowed her to carry that concern because I was building something for her future. Something that would ensure she'd never be dependent on people who measured her worth by her husband's bank account." Caroline made a small, choked sound. "The assets I'm leaving her represent not just money, but freedom. Freedom to choose her own path, to love who she pleases, to define success by her own standards rather than yours. She won't need your approval, your financial support, or your conditional acceptance." Daddy's face had turned an alarming shade of red.
I hope someday you'll realize that your daughter is extraordinary, exactly as she is. But if you don't, at least now she'll never have to prove her worth by your standards again. Mr. Green set down the document and looked around the table. That concludes the reading of Daniel Michael Hartman's last will and testament. Are there any questions about the legal provisions? The explosion, when it came, was swift and devastating. "This is fraud," Mother said, her voice shaking with rage. "No teacher accumulates this kind of wealth honestly. Julia, you had to have known. This has to be some kind of insurance scam or—" "Eleanor," Mr. Green's voice cut through her accusations like a blade. "I will not allow you to impugn my client's character or integrity in my office. Daniel's financial records are impeccable, his investments documented and legal. His insurance policies purchased years before his diagnosis. Every dollar he accumulated was earned honestly and invested wisely." Caroline was staring at me with something between shock and fury. "You knew," she said. "You had to know. All this time letting us think you were struggling, playing the poor widow?" "I didn't know," I said firmly. "Daniel handled our investments. I trusted him to take care of our future, but I had no idea how well he'd succeeded." "This changes everything," Daddy said, his business mind already adapting to the new reality. "Julia, obviously we need to discuss investment strategies, tax implications, estate planning." "No," I said quietly. The single word stopped him mid-sentence. "No," I repeated, stronger now.
You spent years telling me I'd made a mistake marrying Daniel. Yesterday, at his funeral, you publicly humiliated me for choosing love over money. And now, finding out that Daniel was actually wealthy, you want to be involved in my financial decisions? Mother was still reeling. Julia, you can't possibly manage this kind of money on your own. You'll need family support, proper guidance. From people who never believed in my judgment? I stood up slowly, Daniel's letter still folded in my purse, his love wrapped around me like armor. From people who measured my husband's worth by his salary and found him lacking? I looked at each of them in turn. Daniel was right. This money isn't just security, it's freedom. Freedom from ever having to choose between love and your approval again. Mother's composure finally shattered completely. You ungrateful, selfish. She stood up so quickly her chair rocked. Don't think this changes anything, Julia. Money doesn't make you better than your family. You're right. Money doesn't make me better than family. But it does make me independent from people who never learned to value what I had to offer. As they stormed out, Mother muttering about lawyers and challenges, Caroline shooting wounded looks over her shoulder, Daddy already on his phone with someone about investment opportunities I'd never give him access to, I remained seated at the conference table. Mr. Green waited until their voices faded down the hallway before speaking. Daniel knew exactly how they'd react. Every word of that final section was carefully planned to ensure they understood the message. I looked at the will, thick with Daniel's careful planning and quiet love. He protected me even after death. More than protected you, Mr. Green corrected. He freed you. The question now is, what will you do with that freedom? For the first time since Daniel died, I smiled with genuine happiness. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to honor his legacy by living the life he'd made possible, on my own terms, surrounded by people who loved me as I was, never again apologizing for choosing love over their limited definition of success. Daniel had given me the greatest gift possible, the security to be myself without compromise, and I was finally ready to accept it. But Mr. Green wasn't finished with Daniel's final message. As my family's voices faded down the hallway, he cleared his throat and returned to the document in his hands. Julia, he said gently, there's more. Daniel included specific observations about your family's behavior during his illness. He wanted these read into the legal record, but he also wanted you to hear them. Are you prepared for this? I nodded, though my hands were shaking. Daniel had seen everything, even when I thought I was protecting him from the worst of their neglect. Mr. Green's voice was steady as he read. I want to document, for the legal record and for Julia's understanding, the specific ways her family demonstrated their priorities during my final year of life. My stomach clenched. Daniel had been keeping track.
Eleanor Whitfield visited our home exactly 3 times during my 18-month illness. The first visit, 2 weeks after my diagnosis, lasted 47 minutes and ended when she received a call about a charity auction that couldn't wait. The second visit, during my chemotherapy treatments, she spent 23 minutes asking Julia when I might get back to normal and suggesting that Julia seemed overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities. The third and final visit was 6 weeks before my death, when she stayed long enough to inform Julia that dwelling on my illness was unhealthy and that she should consider practical arrangements for moving forward. I closed my eyes, remembering each of those visits with painful clarity. Mother's discomfort with Daniel's weakness, her inability to sit with suffering, her constant suggestions that I was somehow failing in my response to his illness. During my final hospital stay, Mr. Green continued reading, Eleanor called Julia once. The conversation lasted 8 minutes and consisted primarily of Eleanor expressing concern about Julia's obsessive bedside vigil and suggesting she get some perspective about what was happening. The words hit like physical blows.
I'd been so focused on Daniel's comfort during those final days that I hadn't fully processed my family's absence. But Daniel had noticed everything. Richard Whitfield's involvement was limited to 3 phone calls, each focused on financial implications of my illness. He never visited our home, never sent a card or flowers, never asked about my comfort or Julia's well-being. His primary concerns were the cost of my treatments, whether Julia had considered life insurance implications, and when she might need to make arrangements about our house. I remembered those calls, how they'd left me feeling hollow and commodified, as if Daniel's dying was primarily an economic inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. Caroline Whitfield made 2 visits to our home, both lasting less than 30 minutes. During the first, she spent the majority of the time discussing her own children's activities and her husband's promotion, treating my illness as background noise to her family updates. During the second visit, she brought photographs from her recent vacation and seemed genuinely surprised when Julia couldn't muster enthusiasm for cruise ship stories while her husband was dying. Caroline's visits had been particularly painful because they'd felt like parodies of support, the appearance of caring without actual care. She'd performed the role of concerned sister just long enough to ease her own conscience. I want to contrast this, Daniel's voice continued through Mr. Green, with the behavior of our chosen family during the same period. My breath caught. Daniel had been documenting the love alongside the neglect. Maria Lopez visited 43 times, bringing homemade soup, sitting with me so Julia could shower or rest, and reading aloud from books we both enjoyed. She never made my illness about herself, never rushed to leave, never treated my dying as an inconvenience to her schedule. Tears were streaming down my face now. Maria had been there constantly, this young woman who owed us nothing, but gave us everything. Pastor Henry Caldwell visited weekly, sometimes more often when I was struggling. He prayed with us, listened to our fears, and helped us find meaning in my dying. His presence was comfort, not obligation. Mrs. Patterson from next door mowed our lawn for 8 months, brought casseroles every Tuesday, and checked on Julia daily. She asked about my pain levels, remembered my medication schedule, and treated my illness as something that mattered to our entire neighborhood. The contrast was devastating and beautiful. All around us, people had shown up with love. My family had shown up with calculations. I document these differences not to shame Julia's blood relatives, but to ensure she understands where true loyalty was demonstrated. Julia worried constantly that she was being selfish by keeping me from family activities during my illness. The truth is, your family kept themselves from us when we needed them most. Mr. Green paused, glancing at me with concern. I was crying openly now, but I nodded for him to continue. Julia, your family measured their love by convenience and comfort. When loving me became difficult, they withdrew. When supporting you required genuine sacrifice, they found excuses. They treated my dying as an imposition rather than an opportunity to show grace. The truth of it was overwhelming. I'd made so many excuses for their absence, blamed their discomfort with illness, their busy schedules, their different ways of showing care, but Daniel had seen clearly what I'd been too generous to acknowledge. Your mother accused you yesterday of never caring about family. This accusation reveals her fundamental misunderstanding of what family means. You cared so deeply about family that you redefined it to include people who actually showed up for you. You chose loyalty over lineage, presence over promises, and love over obligation. Mr. Green sat down to document and waited while I composed myself. When I could speak again, my voice was hoarse. He saw everything.
Daniel was a teacher, Mr. Green said quietly. He spent his career observing human behavior, understanding motivations, recognizing patterns. He loved you enough to document the truth, even when that truth was painful. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to bridge the gap between my family and Daniel, making excuses for their coldness, hoping they'd eventually see his worth. All that time, Daniel had been quietly noting their failures while never making me choose between them and him. The final section, Mr. Green continued, is addressed directly to your family, though I suspect they won't return to hear it. I wiped my eyes. Read it anyway. They need to hear it, even if they're not here. To Eleanor, Richard, and Caroline, you had 18 months to show Julia that blood relationships could compete with chosen ones. You had countless opportunities to demonstrate that your love was stronger than your discomfort, your loyalty deeper than your convenience. You failed every test. The words hung in the quiet office like a judgment. Julia will grieve my death, but she will not grieve the family relationships you chose to abandon during my illness. She gave you every chance to be present, to matter, to earn the loyalty you demanded by right of birth. Your absence during my dying was your choice. Her independence from your expectations is mine. I sat back in the chair, feeling lighter despite my tears. Daniel had given me permission to stop carrying the guilt of my family's failures, to stop taking responsibility for their inability to love unconditionally. The final paragraph, Mr. Green said, is just for you. Julia, my brave, beautiful wife, you are free now in every way that matters, free from their judgments, their conditions, their definitions of what your life should be. Use this freedom to build the life we dreamed of, surrounded by people who see your worth without needing it proven to them. Live boldly, love freely, choose your own family, and never apologize for those choices again. The silence that followed was different from before, not heavy with tension, but light with possibility. Daniel had left me more than money. He'd left me the truth about my relationships, the validation of my choices, and the courage to stop trying to earn love from people who'd never learned how to give it. "Are you all right?" Mr. Green asked. I was better than all right. For the first time in years, I was free. I walked home slowly after the will reading, taking the long route through downtown so I could process what had just happened. The October air was crisp and clean, and the familiar streets of our small town felt different somehow, more welcoming, more truly mine. Daniel had been gone for only 4 days, but I felt his presence more strongly now than I had since his death. Not in a mystical way, but in the practical reality of his love made manifest through months of careful planning. Every dollar he had saved, every investment he had made, every word of his final message had been chosen with my future in mind. As I passed the coffee shop where we'd first met, I saw Maria through the glass. She was sitting at a corner table with a young woman I didn't recognize. Both of them bent over what looked like college application forms. When she saw me through the glass, Maria's face lit up with such genuine joy that I felt my throat tighten with gratitude. She came outside immediately, wrapping me in one of her fierce hugs. "Mrs. Hartman, how did it go with the lawyer? Are you okay?" I found myself laughing through tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Maria, did you know Daniel left money for a scholarship fund in your name?" Her mouth dropped open. "He what?" $25,000 to help first-generation college students. He wanted you to manage it. Maria sat down heavily on the bench outside the coffee shop. "I can't. Mrs. Hartman, that's incredible. He's still teaching, even now." That's exactly what he was hoping for. She looked up at me with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your family was there?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to explain what had happened without breaking down completely. "And they were awful, weren't they?" Maria's voice was gentle but knowing. "They were exactly who they've always been. But Daniel made sure it doesn't matter anymore." Maria studied my face carefully, the way she'd learned to read people in her social work training. "You look different. Stronger, maybe." "I think I'm finally understanding what Daniel tried to tell me before he died," I said. "That our life together wasn't small or insufficient or something to apologize for. It was exactly what it needed to be." We sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the familiar rhythms of small-town life play out around us. Mrs. Chen from the library walked by with an armload of new books, waving cheerfully. Mr. Peterson from the hardware store was helping an elderly customer load supplies into her car. Pastor Caldwell emerged from the church across the street, stopping to chat with teenagers skateboarding in the parking lot. This was Daniel's world, the community he'd chosen to serve. These were the people who'd shown up for him, for us, when it mattered. My family had never understood that this kind of life could be rich in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status. "Mrs. Hartman," Maria said quietly, "can I tell you something Mr. Hartman said to me when I was struggling in college?" I nodded. I was having a really hard semester, feeling like I didn't belong, like maybe I should drop out and save everyone the trouble. And he told me, "Maria, some people are born into families that believe in them. Others have to build their own believing families. Both kinds are equally valid, but the ones you build yourself are often stronger because they're held together by choice instead of obligation." My breath caught. That was pure Daniel, seeing clearly, speaking truth, offering hope. "He said you taught him about building chosen families," Maria continued. "That watching you create connections with your patients, with neighbors, with people like me, it showed him that love multiplies when you give it freely instead of hoarding it for blood relatives." I thought about the community that had surrounded us during Daniel's illness, the network of care that had sustained us both. None of it had been obligated by family duty. All of it had been freely given, gratefully received, and joyfully shared. He was preparing me, wasn't he? For today, for choosing my own path without their approval. Mr. Hartman was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else, Maria agreed. But Julia, Mrs. Hartman, you don't need anyone's permission to live your own life. Not even his. You've always been strong enough to make good choices. Daniel just made sure you'd never have to compromise them for financial reasons. As Maria headed back inside to continue working with her student, I continued my walk home. But instead of feeling empty and lost as I had that morning, I felt purposeful. Daniel hadn't just left me money, he'd left me a roadmap for using my freedom wisely. I thought about the scholarship fund, about the possibilities it represented for students like Maria who needed someone to believe in their potential. I thought about the financial security that would allow me to take risks, to choose meaningful work over high-paying work, to support causes I believed in without worrying about my own survival. For the first time since Daniel's diagnosis, I wasn't afraid of the future. By the time I reached our house, my house now, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. I stood on our front porch looking at the garden we'd planted together last spring and made Daniel a promise. I would use his gifts well. I would honor his memory not by staying frozen in grief, but by living fully in the freedom he'd created for me. I would choose love over fear, generosity over scarcity, and courage over the comfortable cage of my family's expectations. I was ready to build the life Daniel had died believing I deserved. I should have known Mother wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. 2 days after the will reading, she appeared at my front door at 8 in the morning, impeccably dressed, despite the early hour, her expression set in the determined lines I remembered from childhood battles she refused to lose. "Julia, we need to talk." She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past me into the living room with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her presence welcomed, whether it was wanted or not. I followed her in, still in my robe tobe, coffee mug in hand, unprepared for whatever campaign she designed to regain control of the situation. "Nice performance the other day," Mother began, settling into Daniel's reading chair without permission. "Very dramatic. But now that you've had time to think rationally about the situation, we need to discuss some practical matters." I remained standing, sensing that giving ground physically would somehow translate to giving ground emotionally. "What practical matters?" Mother's smile was sharp and patronizing. "This inheritance, Julia, this sudden windfall that Daniel apparently hid from everyone, including you. It's a lovely surprise, I'm sure, but it comes with responsibilities you're not equipped to handle." "Such as?" Mother's smile was sharp and patronizing. "Investment management, for starters, tax implications, estate planning. The scholarship fund alone will require legal oversight and
financial administration. Do you have any idea how to structure a charitable trust? How to manage a portfolio of that size?" I set down my coffee cup and crossed my arms. "I'm sure I can learn." "Of course you think that. Mother said with the sort of condescending affection she had used when I was 10 and announced I wanted to be an astronaut. But Julia, dear, this isn't nursing school. This is serious money, and serious money requires serious expertise, the kind of expertise your family can provide. Here it was, then, the offer I'd known was coming, wrapped in concern, but reeking of control. Your father has contacts at the best investment firms in the state, Mother continued. Caroline's husband has experience with charitable foundations. We can help you set up proper management structures, ensure everything is handled professionally. For a fee, I assume? Mother's expression sharpened. For family, Julia, because we love you and want to protect you from making costly mistakes. The word love, coming from her lips, felt like a slap. Where had this love been during Daniel's illness, during his funeral, during the 18 months when I'd been struggling to care for my dying husband while maintaining my own career and sanity? Let me make sure I understand, I said carefully. You want me to turn over management of Daniel's carefully planned estate to the same family that accused me of abandoning them for choosing to marry him in the first place? Don't be dramatic, Mother snapped, her mask of concern slipping slightly. We had legitimate concerns about Daniel's prospects. It turned out we were wrong about his financial acumen, obviously, but our concerns about your future were valid. You needed security, and we wanted to ensure you'd have it. By pressuring me to leave the man I loved? By encouraging you to think practically about your choices. Mother stood up abruptly, her composure cracking slightly. You were 27, Julia. Beautiful, educated, with opportunities most girls would kill for. And you threw it all away for a small-town teacher who couldn't even afford to take you on a proper honeymoon. We went camping in Yellowstone, I said quietly. It was perfect. It was pathetic. The words exploded out of her, years of frustration finally breaking through her careful control. Sleeping in a tent, cooking over a camp stove, taking pictures with a disposable camera because he couldn't afford anything better? That's not a honeymoon, Julia. That's poverty with a romantic name. I stared at her, seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time, how profoundly she'd misunderstood everything about my marriage, my choices, my definition of happiness. The Yellowstone trip had been magical. Daniel teaching me to identify bird calls, both of us laughing as we struggled to set up our tent, falling asleep under stars more brilliant than any I had ever seen. We'd been broke and blissfully happy, rich in ways Mother would never comprehend. You still don't get it, I said, amazement coloring my voice. Even now, knowing Daniel accumulated more wealth in 15 years of teaching than most people see in a lifetime, you still think our life together was somehow insufficient? Money isn't everything, Mother said stiffly, but security matters, respectability matters, social position matters. Daniel may have been secretly successful, but he was still a high school teacher who drove a 15-year-old car and shopped at thrift stores. And I loved him for exactly those reasons, I said firmly, because he valued substance over appearance, people over possessions, genuine connection over social climbing. Mother's laugh was bitter. How noble, and how convenient that his hidden wealth allows you to maintain that principled stance without any actual sacrifice. The accusation hung in the air between us, ugly and cutting. I felt the old familiar urge to defend myself, to explain, to somehow bridge the chasm between her values and mine. But Daniel's voice echoed in my memory. You chose correctly. And I spent every day of our marriage trying to prove worthy of that choice. You right about one thing, I said calmly. Daniel's planning does make it easier for me to live according to my principles. But I was living according to them long before I knew about the money. The only difference is that now
I don't have to choose between my integrity and my security. Mother was quiet for a moment, and I could see her calculating, trying a different approach. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd heard her in years. Julia, you're my daughter. My only daughter who isn't settled, isn't protected by a husband who can take care of her. Daniel's gone now, and no matter what he left you, you're alone in the world. Family is all you have left. For a moment, I wavered. The little girl in me that spent years craving my mother's approval wanted desperately to believe she was offering genuine love and concern. But Daniel's documentation of their behavior during his illness was too fresh, too detailed, too damning to ignore.
You had 18 months to act like family while Daniel was dying, I said quietly. You chose not to. You don't get to claim that relationship now that it might benefit you financially. Mother's vulnerability vanished, replaced by cold fury. Fine, have it your way, but don't come crying to us when you realize you can't handle this alone. Don't expect us to clean up the mess when your inexperience cost you everything Daniel worked to build. She moved toward the door, then turned back for one final shot. And don't think this inheritance makes you better than your family, Julia. Money doesn't change who you are or where you come from. You'll always be the girl who threw away every advantage she was given for a mediocre man and a small life. After she left, I sat in Daniel's chair and let the silence settle around me. Mother's words should have hurt more than they did, but Daniel's love had built armor around my heart that her cruelty couldn't penetrate. I thought about her final accusation, that money didn't change who I was. She was absolutely right. I was still the woman who'd chosen love over status, partnership over position, authenticity over appearances. The difference was that now I had the freedom to make those choices without apology, without fear, without needing anyone's permission or approval. Daniel had given me the most precious gift possible, the security to be myself completely, surrounded by people who loved me as I was, rather than who they thought I should become. I was finally, fully free. 3 months after Daniel's funeral, I hosted the first annual Julia Hartman Scholarship Dinner in my living room. The house felt alive again, filled with voices and laughter and the kind of warmth that comes from people who genuinely care about each other. Maria had organized everything with the efficiency she'd learned in social work, but the guest list had grown organically. Pastor Caldwell was there, of course, along with Mrs. Patterson and the Chens from the library. 5 of Daniel's former students had driven in from various colleges, eager to contribute to the scholarship fund that would help other kids like them. Even Mr. Peterson from the hardware store had come, bringing his wife and a casserole that smelled like heaven. "I can't believe how much we've raised already," Maria said, reviewing the numbers on her laptop. "Between the initial $25,000 and the donations that have come in since word got out, we're looking at enough to help 6 students this year." I smiled, watching Pastor Caldwell deep in conversation with Tommy Rodriguez, one of Daniel's former students, who was now studying engineering. Daniel would be so proud. He always said his real legacy would be measured in lives changed, not test scores or graduation rates. "Speaking of legacies," Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of wine, "have you given any thought to what comes next for you, dear?" It was a question I'd been asked dozens of times since the will reading. Everyone seemed to expect that sudden financial security would lead to dramatic life changes, travel, a new career, maybe even leaving town for somewhere more cosmopolitan. But as I looked around my living room, filled with the people who'd become my chosen family, I knew exactly what came next. "I'm staying," I said simply. "This is home. These are my people. Daniel and I built something here, and I'm not ready to walk away from it." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Good. We need you here, Julia. The community needs you." She was right, though I was still discovering what that meant. In 3 months since Daniel's death, I'd been approached about joining the school board, volunteering with Maria's scholarship program, and even running for town council. For the first time in my life, I had the financial freedom to choose work based on passion rather than necessity.
I'd reduced my nursing shifts to part-time, focusing on the hospice care that felt most meaningful after my experience with Daniel. The families I worked with now understood that I truly knew what they were going through, and that shared understanding created deeper connections, better care, more healing for everyone involved. "Mrs. Hartman," called out Sarah Chen, a high school senior who'd received the scholarship fund's first award, "could you tell us about Mr. Hartman's favorite books? I want to make sure I read everything he thought was important." I found myself surrounded by young faces, all eager to understand the man who was making their educations possible. As I talked about Daniel's love for Steinbeck's compassion and Morrison's truth-telling, I realized this was exactly what he'd hoped for, his influence multiplying through new generations, his values spreading through literature and learning and the simple act of believing in young people's potential. He used to say that books were democracy in action, that every story gave you the chance to live another life, understand another perspective, expand your capacity for empathy. He thought reading made better humans, and better humans made a better world. Tommy raised his hand like he was still in Daniel's classroom. Did he ever talk about what he wanted to be remembered for? I paused, thinking back to one of our last conversations before the cancer took too much of his energy for deep discussions. He said he hoped people would remember that he showed up, that when students needed someone to believe in them, when neighbors needed help, when I needed a partner who would choose love every single day, he showed up. He said showing up was the most radical thing you could do in a world that made it easy to stay disconnected.
The room grew quiet, thoughtful. These young people understood instinctively what my biological family had never grasped, that Daniel's true wealth hadn't been measured in dollars, but in the lives he'd touched, the love he'd freely given, the community he'd helped create through simple, consistent kindness. "That's what this scholarship is really about," Maria added. "Not just paying for college, but investing in people who will show up for others the way Mr. Hartman showed up for us." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself on the front porch with Pastor Caldwell, watching the last of the cars pull away. The October air was crisp with promise, and the stars were brilliant in the clear country sky. "You look peaceful," Pastor Caldwell observed. "More peaceful than I've seen you since before Daniel got sick." He was right. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't worried about anything. Not money, not my family's approval, not whether I was making the right choices or living up to anyone else's expectations. "I think I finally understand what Daniel was trying to teach me," I said. "That family isn't about obligation or blood or meeting someone else's standards. It's about choosing to show up for each other again and again, especially when it's difficult." "And you've chosen well," Pastor Caldwell said gently. "Look at what you've built here, Julia. Look at the people who love you not because they have to, but because of who you are." 3 months ago, I'd stood at Daniel's funeral feeling isolated and judged, questioning whether my choices had been naive or selfish. Tonight, I was surrounded by evidence that love really did multiply when shared freely, that a life built on authentic relationships was richer than any amount of money or social status. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Heard about your scholarship dinner. Mom says you're playing at being philanthropic. Hope you know what you're doing." I looked at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Caroline and my parents had made their choice about what mattered to them. I'd made mine. Later, after Pastor Caldwell had gone home and the house was quiet again, I walked out to the backyard where Daniel and I had planted our garden. The vegetables had been harvested weeks ago, but the flowers were still blooming, late cosmos and asters that would keep giving color until the first hard frost. I sat on the bench Daniel had built for our second anniversary, looking up at the stars and feeling his presence in the peace that surrounded me. Not the mystical presence of ghost stories, but the practical presence of a love so carefully planned and deeply rooted that it continued to sustain me even after death. "We did good, didn't we?" I whispered to the night sky. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and somewhere in its sound I heard Daniel's answer. "We chose correctly, Jules. We chose love, and love never ends." I sat there for a long time, wrapped in gratitude for the life we'd built together and excitement for the life his gifts had made possible. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in the house we'd restored with our own hands,
surrounded by the community we'd chosen and been chosen by, financially secure enough to spend my days making the world a little better in whatever way felt most meaningful. I was finally living the life Daniel had always believed I deserved, free from others' expectations, rich in authentic relationships, secure enough to be generous, confident enough to trust my own judgment about what mattered. At 35, I was exactly where I belonged. Home, surrounded by chosen family, ready to build on the foundation of love Daniel and I had laid together, ready to show up, day after day, for the people and causes that mattered. Ready to live boldly, love freely, and never again apologize for choosing substance over status, connection over convenience, authenticity over approval. I was free, and I was home, and I was finally, completely myself. Daniel's greatest gift hadn't been the money. It had been the permission to stop trying to earn love from people who'd never learned how to give it unconditionally. And that gift would last a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.